Okay, I'm just gonna make sure it's recording real quick. Yes. Okay. Oops. Uh-oh. We're doing the preview a little too quickly. Okay. Cool. So, so my name is Makala, and this is my QFT lesson that I did for the methods course in the fall 2025 semester. So this QFT lesson I did with the intention of sharing it with younger children, specifically sixth graders, and I did it in regards to the civil rights movement, specifically more so when there were movements away from segregation and people got upset. So before we go into the lesson itself, I want to put the question that Dr. Hicks posed right here. How have the TPS and the QFT Professional Development Program begun to shape my understanding of how to teach difficult knowledge through a disciplinary, inquiry-based lens? So I kept this question in mind as I went through this presentation and finalizing my QFT lesson, but I'll touch more so on my growth at the very end of this presentation. So I won't touch on this right now. So this is an example of a slide that the middle schoolers might see. One priority of mine before I even go into the lesson at hand is to tell them and make it clear that the information that we're going to be discussing at this time is hard history. And because it's hard history, that means that they need to be treating these stories and photos and anything they see with respect, because these are real things that happened. And while there's more bad and good at this time, so therefore, like, because there's more bad things that happened at this time than good, and we know now today that it's wrong, right? At the time, not everybody knew it was wrong, and if they did, they tried to hide it. But this is a preface to the lesson at hand to show the students that they need to be treating it with respect and disrespect will not be tolerated. If there are any students that would need a break, they can step out. They're very young, and I don't know how much in depth they would have known this information before. So this might be new for them, but I want to make it clear that this is not something to mess around with. Like, this is going to be hard history, so we have to treat it with respect. Then they would see some larger questions of the day. So these are questions that they would have accessible on their notes and also to think about in the back of their minds. They wouldn't have answers to these questions right now, but two questions that I came up with that could help guide this lesson are: why do people protest and how can protest create change? So these are the two questions they would have accessible to them. They can also create their own questions if they feel like those help them with the material, but these are two guiding questions that I have for the lesson. So this is an example of a slide that they might see when it comes to being exposed to the QFT image that they're going to do the QFT on. So they'll be instructed not to talk with their peers and just to create questions based on what they see. There's also a question at the bottom that is guiding them to ask what they see. And then after they make those observations, they can either write those down and then make questions from there, or they can go straight into the questions part. But because they're so young, it might do them some good to just write down what they see before they start asking questions. So that's kind of why there's a guiding question at the bottom for them. So they would also be instructed to talk with their table groups after they've created their questions. So there's a couple of steps here. So they would compare the questions they wrote with their peers, see if there are any similarities or differences in their thought processes. They would choose the top three best questions asked. So they would only have to label three of the questions open or closed as opposed to, let's say, 20 questions, if that's the totality of all of the questions they came up with. They would label them as open or closed, which at this point they would know what an open or closed question is. This is something we would have gone over in class. And then if their questions are closed, they would be instructed to change them to open-ended questions. So very simple rules that they can see in a font that they can read. So yeah. And then after that, everybody would come back together. All of the groups would be prepared to share at least one question that they thought was good that their group came up with. They would choose the best question them and their group created. They'd be ready to share with the whole class. And then, of course, there's some more guiding at the bottom. Why do you want to know about this photo? What do you want to know about this photo? This is to help them because they're so young. And then this would be very much fine-tuned when it comes to the actual lesson, but at the end of the entire lesson, so this is after the QFT and after the teacher actually goes into the teaching portion of the lesson, they would create a mind map where they would write a big topic or question in the middle and then from there create offshoots. And the teacher would do an example of that. So I would do an example with my students such that they would know how to do this activity. So for the procedure, we're going to do a little switcheroo on my thought process behind creating the lesson and what I used to do it. So I'm going to go briefly through each of the modules and how they help me. So module one was very much so about introducing the QFT process as a whole, and this helped me with creating the lesson and really like having that foundation when it comes to what am I going to do? How am I going to approach this? What activities am I going to do before and after the QFT? Like just kind of putting those guidelines in place before I even think about choosing a primary source. Which brings us into module two, which talks about finding primary sources through the Library of Congress website. So this particularly helped me with navigating that website and choosing a source that was appropriate for the material at hand. We have module three, which is about the usage of the primary source in conjunction with the lesson material. So why does it matter? How is it going to help lead the students into the lesson at hand? All of that. And then module four, which is the initial stimulus or larger items. So the question, any prior images they would have seen, which they will see in previous lessons, any things that they would have been introduced, all of that. So module four was much focus on that, and that helped me with the creation of the lesson and how I'm going to segue into it from what the students already know. So this is a little bit of a background about the image. So the image is about the Little Rock Nine, and there's a protest happening here where a bunch of people, specifically older white men, are marching to protest against the Little Rock Nine being integrated into Central High. And one of the main focal points of this photo is that a young African American boy, which is similar in age to the students at this time, is watching. So there's a very stark separation here. He's all the way over here, they're all the way over there. There's also a question of are there police? If they're police, who are they protecting? Why are there so many of them and only one of him? Where is this? What's the economy like? There's a lot of questions that can be asked here. But one of the things that is most prevalent about this image is that there is a stark difference between the large group and that being an older generation versus this young boy just watching all of this anger and dissent happening as they march towards the high school. So, some topics of discussion that I would touch on this lesson are racism, segregation, protest, and emotion. The first three of these topics are things that the students would have already seen, maybe not as much protest as much as racism and segregation. These would not be new topics to them. But emotion, I really want to tie this into emotion and how human emotion impacts action because I feel like that can be an interesting study of how things have changed during this time and how they continue to change in the future. And then we have personal and peer insights. So there's a couple of things that I mentioned. This lesson plan can be done very powerfully, but it also depends on how it's carried out. The curiosity of the children may also spike some side conversations or even some topics that I might not know as much about. So I would have to do research and get back to them on it. And then also, one point of feedback from Alex is that human emotion is a great thing to focus on in this issue. Not a lot of people do focus on it, but it's a great way of tying in how things change based on the widespread emotion that was happening during this period. So, some personal growth of mine is that regarding inquiry, like asking questions, having students ask questions before even being introduced to the information at hand makes the information more relevant. This isn't something I really thought about until being introduced to this assignment. We also have hard history, and also teaching hard history doesn't have to be just like a lecture format like direct instruction. I understand that teaching hard history can't have like cutesy fun activities because that's not good in terms of morality, but the QFT method is a way of getting the students involved in terms of the learning process without them just being talked at. Primary sources are also one of the best ways to show students a human story. And also, in terms of the application, the QFT method is easily adaptable. And so, I personally want to know if I can find ways to implement it in any prior lessons that I've taught or created, specifically those that I've implemented in my cooperating teachers class in my field study. So this brings us back to the question that Dr. Hicks posed. How have the TPS and QFT professional development program begun to shape my understandings of how to teach difficult knowledge through a disciplinary inquiry-based lens? So the question part of the inquiry-based lens is the most important part, in my opinion, because I never thought that students could ask questions about material before even being presented with the material at hand. But I think that it's a great way of getting them hooked. I think that the QFT allows them to talk to their peers and bounce ideas off of each other. So something they might not have originally thought of, maybe they get from one of their peers and they expand on that. Also, creating open and closed-ended questions from that is great, and ending up to like being able to convert the closed questions to the open questions is great too, because a yes or no answer, like an answer that can be a question that can be answered with a simple yes or no or like one word answer isn't as fun as a question that is more nuanced and also will help the students with critical thinking. I think that critical thought is something that needs to be preserved. I think that in the age of AI and with students having a stunted uh, growth in terms of their mindsets, especially after COVID, it's very challenging for a lot of them to engage in critical thinking. So I think that this is one of the ways in which critical thinking can be facilitated in the classroom. Um, but yeah, so these are my thoughts. This is my lesson. I look forward to tweaking it in the future or seeing if I can implement it perhaps in my not field study, student teaching experience next semester. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed. So I'm gonna stop the recording now. Um, oh, so that's where the transcript is. I hope it shows up on the recording. Okay, I'm gonna stop it.